the communists in Yan'an and not monopolized by the nationalist regime then in Chongqing. And of course, the nationalist government at that time was the internationally recognized government of China. So when the communist revolution was still in the balance, China Resources would serve many different functions by relying on global commerce and leveraging its overseas connections to supply, fund, and support the party. And this history of China Resources, I think, would complicate our understanding of the origins of the Chinese Revolution. Because as many of you know, the Chinese Communist Party triumphed by harnessing the support of peasants from the countryside instead of workers in the cities. The party itself has mostly emphasized its history as the vanguard of China's peasantry. But I think that the role of Chinese front companies like China Resources illustrates how this rural insurgency actually depended on international commerce, overseas link. And it demonstrates how these dichotomies of urban and rural, Chinese, foreign, might have been more fluid than one supposes. So even before 1949, when the People's Republic was founded, China Resources had already played a very significant role in the revolutionary history of the Chinese Communist Party. But the company would face its biggest challenge after 1949. So let's look at the second part of this company's history when China Resources would help the People's Republic circumvent economic and diplomatic containment during the early Cold War. So just after a year was founded, the People's Republic of China intervened in the Korean War in November 1950, pushing back American and United Nations troops across the 38th parallel on the Korean Peninsula. And in response, the United Nations, the United States, and Western allies would impose a series of embargoes, trading restrictions on China, prohibiting not just the export of war material, but also a range of goods, agricultural products, machinery, and so forth. Some of these restrictions were rolled back after the Korean War, but many of them would remain for decades. Now, the People's Republic vowed to break what it would denounce as an illegal imperialist embargo, and China Resources would play a leading role in this response. Now, the company and its many subsidiaries in Hong Kong would mobilize to circumvent the embargo through so-called buying sprees. Basically, company agents would submit orders under different names. They would place orders or cargo under different ships, like Soviet ships or British ships as cover. And so basically trying to spend as much as possible their foreign exchange to secure these precious goods. Meanwhile, China Resources also would turn to Hong Kong courts. This is actually something that's very interesting. The company would sue other companies in the United States or other companies in Europe that would not ship their goods to China, or sue banks that would freeze the funds that China Resources had overseas. The company actually won many of these lawsuits. These courtroom victories are very interesting, and they were all the more important during this period when the PRC didn't have any sort of diplomatic recognition, and it didn't really have many legal avenues to defend its interests. So it's very interesting that China Resources would use British or Hong Kong courts to basically fight the American embargo. During the Korean War, China Resources also organized some smuggling routes, smuggling channels between Hong Kong, Macau, and the People's Republic, moving strategic goods back and forth past different embargoes, past different barriers. After the Korean War, many countries, except the United States, would relax some of their trade restrictions with China, with the People's Republic, and China Resources would then play an important role trying to promote Chinese trade, trying to promote Chinese exports. For instance, the company helped organize the first Canton Export Fair, which, as many of you know, it's now still held annually. It has arranged the itineraries of foreign visitors who wanted to travel and do business in China. It would dispatch trade delegations to Western Europe, to Japan, to Southeast Asia, to negotiate and to conclude trade agreements with the PRC. So at the height of the Cold War, China Resources would leverage its role as a Hong Kong registered company to help connect the People's Republic with anyone, any firm or any country in the capitalist world, serving as this sort of intermediary for doing business with China. And so, wielding this sort of carrot of trade was something that China Resources expertly employed, not only to circumvent containment during the Cold War, but it would also have some diplomatic consequences. For instance, China Resources would try to strike deals with Western countries, countries that would be allied with the United States, but wanted to do business with the People's Republic. So it had not just commercial consequences, but also diplomatic consequences during the Cold War. Now, let me turn to another facet of China Resources in circumventing Cold War containment, which is supplying Hong Kong. And I want to highlight these economic connections between the PRC and Hong Kong in the decades before the 1980s. Now, many people have taken for granted that Hong Kong has always looked to China for critical supplies. It's almost a truism, especially today, that many things in Hong Kong come from China, given the proximity of the two. But what are the contours of this supply pipeline? How did this supply pipeline actually develop, and how did Chinese goods actually get to Hong Kong before the 1980s? And to consider all these questions, I'm going to focus on two critical commodities, food and oil. I'm going to look at how much Hong Kong's needs in food and oil were supplied by the PRC during the Cold War, and what role that China Resources played in that supply. So let's begin with food. So during the 1950s, China Resources and its subsidiaries would supply Hong Kong with fruits, vegetables from southern China, especially from Guangdong, right across the border. This trade began on a relatively small scale, but the supply of food from China into Hong Kong would later expand dramatically with the creation of a new supply network. In the early 1960s, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Railways would propose a plan to supply Hong Kong with fresh food, fresh livestock. At this time, the PRC desperately needed foreign exchange in order to pay for imports. So supplying Hong Kong was actually a great way to do just that. Supplying agricultural products to Hong Kong, they could then earn foreign exchange, which the People's Republic could then use to buy imports from elsewhere in the world. And after securing the support of senior leaders, including Premier Zhou Enlai, the two ministries would organize a series of trains, dedicated express trains, to transport fresh food, fresh produce from the agricultural heartland of central China to Shenzhen, right across the border from Hong Kong. Once the trains terminated in Shenzhen, a fleet of trucks hired by China Resources would bring the food across the Hong Kong border, would distribute the livestock to the rest of the city, thereby leveraging the company's distribution networks and its monopoly on mainland food. Now, this supply network did not appear overnight. It actually experienced considerable growing pains at first. During the 1960s, when this supply network was just getting started, an estimated 30 to 60% of livestock, of all the pigs and all the animals, died during transport. That is a very, very huge loss rate. But by the 1970s and 80s, this supply network would be improved. Better transportation techniques, the construction of new warehouses, cold storage facilities, eventually pushed the loss rate to less than 1%. These warehouses, as many of you probably already know, these warehouses still exist. They're all over in the new territories, for instance, in a place like Shatian. To give you a sense of how dominant Chinese food imports were in Hong Kong, this is a graph showing Hong Kong food imports. So from the mid 1950s all the way to the early 1980s, food imports from China made up roughly half of total food imports into Hong Kong every year. And the share from China was bigger than the shares of the next four countries combined. So China was the biggest supplier of food to Hong Kong, for decades by far. So these figures, looking at this slide, you can see how big of a role China played in the Hong Kong food market. But as impressive as these figures might seem, they still might understate the importance of China resources in supplying the Hong Kong food market. So data from the late 1970s already show that up to 80% of non-staple foodstuffs in Hong Kong were already provided by China. But by 1990, the market share for many of these items rose to almost 100%. So basically, beef, pork, lamb, eggs, other food in Hong Kong not only came from one country, they came from one company. Again, China Resources or its subsidiary was delivering most of these food. So that's food. Let's move on to the other important commodity, which is oil. So Hong Kong, again, as many of you know, has no sources of its own oil. It does not have its own refineries. In the decades after the Second World War, Hong Kong actually imported much of its oil from either Southeast Asia or from the Middle East. But the global oil shocks of the 1970s would destabilize the Hong Kong oil market, just as it did elsewhere. Fuel prices in Hong Kong actually would double by the end of the 1970s from the first oil shock in 1973. And during this moment of crisis, the Hong Kong government turned to China Resources to inquire about the availability of Chinese supplies of oil. Basically, the colonial government at the time was asking China Resources, hey, does China have any oil that it could sell to Hong Kong? And the answer, it turns out, was yes. From late 1973 into 1974, the Hong Kong government would negotiate with representatives of China Resources to increase oil supplies to Hong Kong. At this time, during the early 1970s, China was not a major global producer of oil, but it was also not a major consumer of oil. So it had a lot of excess supply, a lot of surplus oil that it could actually sell. And it was very eager to profit from these much higher prices in the aftermath of the oil shocks. Basically, the oil shocks actually created an opportunity for the People's Republic to sell their surplus oil at much higher prices. And Hong Kong was the perfect market for this. Before the 1973 oil shocks, China Resources did supply Hong Kong with light diesel fuel. But after the agreement with the Hong Kong government, the company would soon export so-called domestic petroleum. This was fuel produced in China that was suitable for automobiles, suitable for industrial use. And it marked the first time that China would export oil beyond its borders. So Hong Kong was basically sort of the first market that China would export oil to. And during the 1970s, China Resources served as the primary supplier of this new Chinese export to Hong Kong. It also worked very closely with several Hong Kong businessmen to set up a retail network of gas stations to, throughout the city to distribute and sell Chinese gas. By the end of the decade, the company dramatically expanded its presence dramatically expanded the supply of Chinese oil in the Hong Kong market with the construction of these new oil storage facilities to house Chinese oil, the biggest of which is this one right here. This is the 8-acre Chinese Resources Oil Storage Depot, which I believe is no longer, it actually had to close down because of environmental reasons. But nonetheless, it gives you a sense how big this business was, how big this scope of this operations was. Because by the 1980s, the company had the second largest oil depots in Hong Kong. So this trade was really massive in scale. And we can see the dramatic impact of China's resources entry into the Hong Kong oil market. China's share of Hong Kong's petroleum imports, if you look at the red right there, it was virtually negligible. It was almost nothing before 1973. But by the end of the 1970s, less than 10 years, the share of Chinese oil in the Hong Kong market jumped to 30%. So even though the share was not as big as the share in the food market, China Resources still managed to grab a significant share of the market in less than a decade. Again, in less than 10 years, it went to virtually 0 to 30%. One magazine later noted that gas, petrol, propane from China Resources would power Hong Kong, everything, including cars, buses, luxury hotels, factories, gas stations, even the famous Star Ferry apparently ran on gas or oil from China Resources. So even before China formally embarked on economic reforms, the country had already dominated key economic sectors in Hong Kong. And once again, China Resources was right at the forefront of this drive. Supplying Hong Kong would earn precious exchange for the People's Republic, and it would expand its footprint, its economic footprint in a critical market. And once again, thereby circumventing Cold War economic containment. Let me now move on to the final part of China Resources history by looking at its role in working with capitalists on behalf of Communist China during the Cold War. So as many of you know, the People's Republic of China was founded on the revolutionary principles of anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism. At home, the regime would steadily suppress private entrepreneurship and would attack capitalists as enemies, class enemies, during the first 3 decades. Now that's at home, but abroad, the PRC demonstrated much more pragmatism, much more willingness in working and trading with capitalist businesses, capitalist countries, capitalist merchants. For example, China Resources worked very closely with major British firms in Hong Kong. When China Resources sought a middleman to sell Chinese exports, it would turn to firms like Jardine Matheson. When it sought to basically store its foreign exchange or to house its supply of gold, it would turn to the bank HSBC. These are just the most prominent examples. We have actually many more. But China Resources would develop much more intimate relations with Chinese businessmen in Hong Kong, some of whom were red capitalists, so-called red capitalists. These were businessmen who lived in Han Chinese businessmen who lived in Hong Kong. They made their fortunes in Hong Kong. They benefited from their dealings with the capitalist world. Yet these so-called red capitalists proved very willing to do business with Communist China, whatever their motivations of these red capitalists were. Whether it was patriotism, as many of them said it was, whether it was profit, pragmatism, whatever their motives were, many of these red capitalists would turn to China Resources as their primary business partner. And the company would focus a lot of efforts in trying to court Chinese business circles in Hong Kong. So for instance, the Hong Kong Chinese General Chamber of Commerce, which represented Chinese businesses, Chinese businessmen in the colony, welcomed PRC front companies into its ranks. Almost immediately after it was registered, China Resources became a member of the organization, and it became a major sponsor of the chamber, as this cover for this special edition of the Chinese General Chamber of Commerce handbook shows. It also became a major sponsor. So very early in its history, China Resources was already actively wooing Chinese businesses in Hong Kong. And these are some of the examples of China Resources working with red capitalists in Hong Kong. But I think there is no better example. Let me just focus on one example. And I think the example that I'm going to look at is this gentleman by the name of Henry Fok, Hu Yingdong. Henry Fok, as many of you in Hong Kong know, was one of the biggest tycoons in the city. His rise to fame and fortune was actually very much tied to the history of China Resources. And I think his case illustrates the very tight connections the company enjoyed with Chinese businessmen in the city. So let me just devote the final part of this presentation to the story of Henry Fok. So as this article indicates, Fok enjoyed a miraculous rags to riches story. It's funny because I have to explain who Henry Fok is when I give this presentation abroad, but here in Hong Kong, I'm sure you all already know this story, but let me just repeat it anyway. So Henry Fok, as many of you know, he was born into an impoverished family. He was an ethnic Hakka. He would eventually inherit a very modest fishing business, and he may well have remained a small proprietor until the Korean War. With the introduction of embargoes, of the trade restrictions, Chinese front companies like China Resources, they had to find ways to move critical supplies into China. As I mentioned earlier, China Resources resorted to smuggling to circumvent the embargo. And all of a sudden, in this environment, Henry Fok's fishing fleet, his fleet of boats actually became very attractive and very useful for this scheme. And indeed, Henry Fok would deploy his fishing fleet on behalf of China Resources to smuggle critical supplies from Hong Kong to Macau, and then to China, or even directly to China during the war. And these goods included everything from oil to rubber to steel, hardware, tires, medicines, and other machinery. Henry Fok always claimed that he never smuggled weapons, and that he always claimed that he never made that much money. He made a little bit, he said, I made a little bit of money, not a lot, especially given the risks involved. So, but however much he made, whatever the money that he made from this venture, there's no doubt that he would build on this wealth in the following decades as a real estate tycoon, as a business mogul. There is also no doubt that he would continue also his partnership with China Resources in various ways. So, for example, during the 1970s, when China Resources began importing oil for sale in Hong Kong, it was Henry Fok who was one of the first businessmen to be tapped to serve as one of the exclusive retail agents. He actually co-founded one of the companies that went on to build this network of gas stations selling Chinese oil across the city. Fok would also translate his partnership with China Resources into political influence, both in Hong Kong and in China. This is a picture of him with 3 generations of Chinese leaders. During the 1980s and beyond, he served as a delegate in the National People's Congress. He was also invited to serve on various committees that would manage the handover of Hong Kong. Furthermore, this recognition by Chinese leaders would help Fok reinvent his image. He had initially an image as this very shady smuggler, very shady businessman, and by the 1980s, by the 1990s, he became this respectable tycoon, respectable patriot. So again, Fok is a very notable example, but there are many cases of capitalists in Hong Kong and Macau, actually, who gladly worked with China Resources and the People's Republic during the Cold War, and whatever their motivations, again, whether it's pragmatism, profit, or patriotism, these businessmen would help connect the People's Republic with the global economy throughout the Cold War, and at the same time, earning quite a bit of money, for their troubles. So let me go ahead and just wrap up this presentation with a few concluding thoughts. So again, my research is still in the preliminary stages. I'm still doing research. I'm still thinking through some of these implications of my findings. I'm still writing. So my project on the shadow economies of Greater China, I'm trying to provide an alternative perspective to the Cold War. I'm trying to look at the many ways that companies, businessmen, travelers would negotiate or circumvent geopolitical barriers. And I think this perspective, this new perspective on the Cold War is still very much needed. Until very recently, scholarship on China and the Cold War usually followed the trajectory of major events, whether you're talking about the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, the Taiwan Straits crises, Sino-Soviet split, Sino-American rapprochement, and so forth. Or research on China and the Cold War would focus on high-level personalities, elite diplomacy, books on looking at, what did Mao think during the Taiwan Straits crises, or what did Chiang Kai-shek think during the Korean War, and so forth. And what I think research on the case of China Resources, what I think it shows is that in the shadow of these superpower rivalries, there were a lot of actual cross-border connections. There were a lot of connections that did not necessarily conform to these larger narratives of the Cold War. And these were connections that were forged because of efforts to segment different economies. So more work is going to be needed to connect these different economies, unearth these underground conduits, and identify some shadowy participants, which I'm still trying to do. Another important avenue of inquiry in the case of China Resources that I think it could really help us rethink is this relationship between China and Hong Kong during the Cold War. Now, in recent years, there has been a reappraisal of the Chinese economy during the Mao years. Despite the political turmoil, primitive accumulation, improvements in infrastructure and human capital, all of this actually unfolded under a relatively strong state. And all of this would help the People's Republic take full advantage in the shift of the global economy during the 1980s. So again, this is sort of a rethinking of China under Mao, the economy of China under Mao. Meanwhile, there is also a reappraisal of the Hong Kong economy during the late 20th century. Recent books like Peter Hamilton's excellent study rightly argues how Hong Kong became a major contributor in the transformation of global capitalism, how the history of neoliberalism, how the history of our current global economy is really incomplete without taking Hong Kong into account. You cannot write a history of the 20th century, late 20th century global economy or the 21st century global economy without writing about Hong Kong, without thinking about Hong Kong. And I think what the case of China Resources might offer is maybe a bridge to these different scholarships, because it shows how the PRC through China Resources was not just this bystander in the global economy until the 1980s, but actually a participant, by feeding Hong Kong workers, by powering Hong Kong factories that transformed late 20th century global capitalism. This is, how, I guess, one way to think about how China was engaged in the global economy indirectly through Hong Kong, but still engaged nonetheless. And finally, I think the history of China Resources also offers new perspective on Hong Kong-China relations. Most people would take for granted that the People's Republic wields considerable influence in Hong Kong society, economy, and politics. Definitely after 1997, but especially in the years leading up to 1997. But what the history of China Resources shows for me is that the actual organs, the actual individuals who participated in this larger project actually goes back quite a bit, not just years, but decades. Men like Henry Fok were not the only red capitalists who straddled the Cold War divide, with playing different sides for patriotism and profit. There are so many others, that I'm starting to uncover, whether they're in Hong Kong, Macau, or in Taiwan. And so I think hopefully by doing this research, we can write a much more expansive history of Greater China, one that illustrates how different individuals and firms would experience, confront, and shape the Cold War world. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and end my presentation here. I welcome any comments or questions that you might have. I will now turn the floor over to Professor Wong for his comments. Or maybe Professor Zhang, you can take over.
Yeah, I think I'll also invite Professor Zhang Wang to share your thoughts and comments on this wonderful presentation. And I feel so much enlightened by the history of China Resources and this renewed understanding of Chinese Revolution, Cold War in Asia, and shadow economy.
Well, thanks very much. It's a delight to be here with everyone today, and thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this conversation. I've been a follower of Professor Tai's work for a long time, and I admire his scholarship. So this is quite a treat. Of course, what we've heard thus far is a fascinating project. What I'm going to comment on is actually more of an invitation to think how this research project speaks to larger themes. In particular, I will look at the flow of goods and capital engineered by China Resources and the brokers behind this trade, and to situate this whole development in the rewiring of global circuitries. I would like to explore how and why of this particular pattern. So, the pattern of flow and how that developed, why that was the case, what goods were exchanged, who brokered the trade, and the now what question, as Professor Tai entered his talk with, as we're entering into a new trading pattern on this part of the world. On the how and the why, I guess we've all learned from our earlier days in the history books, Hong Kong's role as an entrepot in the Cold War context on one side of the bamboo curtain. Of course, it started in the early 50s with the US-led embargo of goods from the PRC. And in that particular arrangement, there was a special status for Hong Kong, special arrangements for Hong Kong. So in that sense, Hong Kong operated somewhat like the 19th century situation in Canton in the role of the old China trade. It was a sole port of call for Western traders in this Chinese landmass, except that this time, in the case of Hong Kong, it was because of a US mandate. So we think about the logic of this embargo. I mean, as Professor Tai pointed out, is an issue of containment. So we are thinking about containment that goes against the, I guess, at least in the early days, this whole notion of autarky for the communist regime. It was not tenable, or at least not optimal, in the case of the People's Republic of China. But it's also an issue within the larger communist bloc as well. And I guess in the earlier part of the study, we need to pay attention to the Sino-Soviet split and how that might have redirected flows. Now, if we were to think about the other side of the bamboo curtain, how determined were they in severing ties, trade ties with mainland China? I often wonder about that, especially given my vantage point here in Hong Kong. So the primary players on the other side of the bamboo curtain would have been the US and the UK. In the case of the UK, the returning British regime was eager to engineer this economic recovery of its colony in Hong Kong, in particular, in terms of food supplies. So they were doing what just needed to be done. There was this certificate of origin that they had instituted in the early part of the post-war period. And with this embargo, they introduced something that is called the comprehensive certificates of origin. So just adding another layer to the process. But how serious were they? Now, in terms of the US, I mean, that was the instigator of this whole arrangement. Did they really want total disengagement with China at this time? Many of the inspectors here in Hong Kong have written their memoirs and said quite explicitly that they knew of this trade. So the embargo ostensibly was to stop such goods from reaching the US, which would then generate foreign reserves for the rival in the PRC. But then Hong Kong and US allies were buying goods from the mainland. So instead of a definitive binary of trade, no trade, licit, illicit, should we be thinking about it as more controlled flows of goods and capital? Was it more of a spigot that was tightened and loosened every now and then during this period? Should we look at the varying situation at that time? Now, moving on to the second topic of what was traded. In my previous work, I looked at an earlier period, and then I jumped to more of the contemporary situation. In the earlier period, it was tea, opium, two things that were highly addictive, so that generated regular trade year after year. And of course, jumping into the more contemporary era, reform era and thereafter, you have the production of cheap Chinese products that flooded the US marketplace, knickknacks that now are taking up a lot of space in the basement and storage spaces in US homes and elsewhere. The year in between was quite different, as Professor Tai pointed out to us. The PRC was not quite mass producing goods in an industrial sense. In one of the two examples Professor Tai offers, foodstuff. I remember growing up, I had some funny products that were canned. They didn't really taste that good. I guess that at least allowed some of the products, Chinese products, to travel a bit. But then there was a lot of fresh produce and meat, as we heard from one or two examples Professor Tai gave us. So that points to a certain limited reach of such Chinese products as they needed to reach the destinations. And we learned that 30 to 60% of the livestock actually perished before the 1970s. And it was only through a lot of struggle that they reduced it to under 1% in the later periods. There was a strong sense of material science, technology, this dimension of the story that I think because of our later focus, we quickly forget. And it was something that needed to be overcome in a very deliberate way. And to shift our focus to my vantage point here in Hong Kong, it was not just a transit point, but also the beneficiary of perishable export items from mainland China that just could not travel too far. So in that sense, it's very much a local Hong Kong story, and I applaud Professor Tai's alerting us to this whole issue of supplying Hong Kong, which has remained critical in the environment today. Just because we've forgotten how China supplied the city in the post-war period and why. Now, shifting our focus to another topic of who, I find the emphasis on China resources very productive. I wonder if we can enlarge the analysis of the social networks even a little bit more. We heard about Jardine, we heard about HSBC, we learned about the Red Capitalists, and of course, Henry Fok for Ying Dong. How these Hong Kong-based actors connect with mainland contacts. And just as importantly, how did they function within the British colonial framework? As I intimated earlier, that many of these officials in the colonial bureaucracy somewhat turned a blind eye to the situation. I think it would be helpful for us to remind ourselves that much of this unfolded in the pre-ICAC days. How exactly did that happen? I mean, these brokers did something grand. They basically lubricated global trade in a very caustic environment. No mean feat. And as a matter of fact, in process, they engineered for Hong Kong the case on that basically underwritten the economic activities of this city. Now, just moving on to the last point, I would like to bring to your consideration the now what question that Professor I ended with. Now, the world is getting rewired. The embargo was lifted a long time ago in the 1970s, and Hong Kong no longer had this unique and special status in the network. And of course, after that, you have China's reform that was even more seismic in its impact. And you have the establishments of special economic zones. So kind of like a new generation of treaty ports, except this time on China's own terms and by its own creation to regulate and control exchange yet again. So how did that change the why? That changed the why and the what of the trade. But how about the who aspect? What was underground and now above ground? What was illicit and now very much illicit? So we tend to think of this in, at least in business history, in terms of geopolitical jockeying, the maneuver by which entrepreneurs legitimate their business. But that's not quite sufficient to capture the nuance of the dynamics here, I would say. The formerly shadowy patriots are now operating in the open and are also getting rewarded for their allegiance in a previous era, for the ingenuity to provide the PRC access to markets overseas during tough times. So politically, the slogan here now is patriots administering Hong Kong. But maybe we also have patriots taking charge of the economic lifeline of Hong Kong as well. I guess that alludes to what Professor Tai said about China under Mao to China today and Hong Kong today. And the logistics of the industry, the logistics industries of Hong Kong, the political dimension, I think, is still very much underappreciated and understudied. So the Professor Tai's study of China resources and the larger project would certainly help us go a long way and help in our understanding of this particular topic. This story has enduring implications for the role of Hong Kong in this new round of geopolitical realignment and economic exchange. And for those of us in Hong Kong, it is important for us to learn from this story as we think about new ways of positioning the city and who best to broker this exchange now. So I look forward to Professor Tai's response and the general conversation that is going to follow. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Zhang. Thank you, Professor Wang. Okay, Philip, hello,
Okay.
Professor Tai. Yeah.
Would you like me to respond first?
Yes, and then we will open the floor.
Okay. I'm going to thank you, Professor Wong, for those really amazing comments. I was trying in vain to write down some of these your points, so I'm just going to go ahead and just answer what I can from what I can. What I basically jotted down, and forgive me if I miss some of your points. So I think that the key issue of rethinking China resources for me, is to understand, or at least look anew at the connections between Hong Kong and China. A lot of the things that I did not appreciate was how deep this trade was. People, again, would talk about the importance of Hong Kong. They usually talk about the importance of Hong Kong during the reform era. China under Mao was this sort of period where Hong Kong, yeah, sure, certain goods were going through from China into Hong Kong, but it was not really exploited as much. I'm going to show one slide that I did not show, just to give everyone a sense. This is the slide that I had actually, sorry, I'm going to see if I can show this. This is a slide that I produced as a draft, but I'm going to go ahead and share it anyway. So basically, this data shows Chinese trade balances by region in US millions through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And basically, the most important part of the slide is to notice, of course, the red, which is the trade surpluses that China racked up with Hong Kong and Macau, mostly Hong Kong. The data doesn't separate Hong Kong and Macau. Basically, if you look at this data, you will notice that trade surpluses in Hong Kong, Macau basically paid for all of the imports for the PRC. And of course, much of this trade surplus in Hong Kong was generated by those goods that I mentioned, food and oil, and was mediated by companies like China Resources and its many subsidiaries, Wu Fanghang, Fenghong, Dexinhang, Duxinghong, these other smaller, these other companies. So in looking at and creating this data, it just really opened my eyes as to how important economically, Hong Kong was to the PRC, to the broader economic trade strategy of the PRC. So I do hope that that this history of China Resources can indeed highlight and help us appreciate this link, and also identify some of these shadowy people. I would indeed like to, I take your point about enlarging some of these social networks, trying to find Hong Kong actors and how they work with the PRC, how they worked within with the British colonial system. And it is, as you suggested, the British government, unsurprisingly, basically knew about this. They turned a blind eye, or they actually actively encouraged it. One question I always was asked was, what did the British think of all this? As companies like China Resources was carving out massive market shares, the British government, or at least the Hong Kong government, actually celebrated it, thinking that this was a sign that China was investing in Hong Kong. This showed that China was, the Hong Kong government called this a mutuality of interest, meaning that the British government and the Chinese government wanted Hong Kong to succeed. So they saw this as a sign of viability for Hong Kong's long-term future. So so the British government actually encouraged more Hong Kong investment, and they would often turn to China Resources, just as they did, for instance, during the oil crisis. Whenever Hong Kong needed anything, they would turn to the PRC via China Resources. One more thing that I wanted to talk about. I think this distinction between controlled and uncontrolled flow might be actually a really good way. This is something I need to really think about. I apologize; it's a little late at my end, so I haven't thought about this. But I would like to really look at how these flows would circulate throughout the region, even despite all of these geopolitical tensions during the Cold War. One interesting leg of this shadow economy that I'm beginning to also research and expand on is the role of Hong Kong as its intermediary between communist China and nationalist Taiwan. I just actually looked at a case where there were basically goods from the People's Republic that were making their way into the Republic of China after 1949 via Hong Kong. There are a lot of goods that were going into Taiwan that the nationalist government there pretty much knew was coming from mainland China, but they had to, they tolerated it because Taiwan at the time, the 1950s, 1960s, didn't have an economy that was self-sufficient. There were a lot of agricultural goods that were being transshipped through Hong Kong, and everybody knew that this was coming from China because Hong Kong was not producing all of this agricultural products. So basically, this is another example of this sort of tacit recognition of these flows that were, whether they were controlled, uncontrolled, legal, illegal, or shades of gray, whatever we want to call it, they were happening. And many of governments there not only knew about it, but they implicitly even accepted or supported it. I don't want to take up too much more time, but I'll probably just give the rest of the time to anyone who wants to ask any questions. So I'll just stop right there.
Yeah,
thank you, Professor Zhang.
Hi. Yeah, I've already seen 2 questions from the chat room. So now we'll just open the floor, and so to the online audience. So any of you, if you have questions, please feel free to either type or just turn on the mic and directly ask Professor Tai. So first question is from Henry Choi. Just a comment: Chinese resources investment in property development of Tianshui Wei, CR's share of 51%, Li Ka-shing's share of 49% in early 1980s when Sino-British negotiations on Hong Kong was going on, can be something to do. Further examination may be related to your research topic.
Yes, thank you, Professor Choi, for that very good point. I'm actually looking at that case, and that's an excellent example because that purchase was the first time that a mainland entity actually bought Hong Kong land on the auction. In fact, as you said, it was done in cooperation with Li Ka-shing, and the land that deal, Mighty City, I believe it's called, had a very interesting history because the land was purchased, the value of the land started going down, and Li Ka-shing actually had to buy that land back from China Resources and then develop it in the 1990s, which I believe now it's a one of those prosperous satellite towns. But yes, thank you very much for that suggestion. Professor Choi, if you happen to know anything more about it, I'm happy to speak to you about it. I'm doing research on that though. Thank you.
Okay, another question from Zhou Zhelun. Also a comment. Professor Tai's talk reminds me of Professor Park Engman's talk of United Front and Hong Kong, Macau last capitalist at this year's AS panel. I'm curious to hear if Chinese Resources Company also came into contact with United Front in the early reform era and how their contacts have any agency in the Hong Kong-China border crossing, for example, knowledge capital, etc. in that period.
Thank you very much for that question. I actually am doing research on the relationship between China Resources and the United Front. And what I'm beginning to discover is that this relationship that China Resources had in cultivating capitalists and cultivating businessmen goes back way before the reform era. When China Resources in 1940s was still a front company for the 8th Route Army, basically the Balu Jun. It was basically, an office, the Hong Kong office, or served as a Hong Kong office for the 8th Route Army. It was working very closely with Hong Kong businessmen, overseas Chinese businessmen, working with, trying to cultivate these kind of relationships. And so the company was, in my opinion, at the forefront of what we would call the United Front strategy. So as for the its role in the early reform period, it was actually interesting because until the 1980s, China Resources had almost a monopoly on issuing visas or organizing tours for foreign businessmen who wanted to go to China. That started loosening up in the early reform era. I haven't actually done that much research up that point, but I think that I would not be surprised if the relationships that the company had built with the businessmen would continue. The relationships that it built in the decades before the reform era would continue into the reform era. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Another question from Song He. Thanks for your wonderful and inspiring talk. I have two questions below. The first one, did China Resources interact or have trade with Taiwan and US, which bridge across the Taiwan Strait and the Pacific Ocean during the Cold War? So this is the first question. And the second one, my third question, which kinds of primary sources do you usually focus on? Is it possible and necessary to get access to the company archives?
Thank you very much for those two wonderful questions. The first question, the answer to that is I am still working on that. I have found, again, a case of a subsidiary of China Resources working in Taiwan after 1950, 1949. That subsidiary was actually uncovered, closed down after an investigation. After the nationalist government discovered this subsidiary working in Taipei, they actually closed it down. They put the owners on trial, sent them to jail for many years. So the answer is I'm beginning to see a little bit of connections after 49, but I'm still trying to look at China Resources and see how their reach might have extended into Taiwan. As for the US, I think there was a case in the 1960s where China Resources started to apply for these export permits, to the US, and the US basically canceled them because they discovered, oh no, this is a Chinese front company. So again, I don't know how extensive the links are, but I do think they existed. And one thing to note is that in some cases, we don't know about these links because China Resources was also applying, these links were being built by subsidiaries of China Resources, which goes by so many different names. I'm still trying to map out the company and its many subsidiaries. It's different names in English, Chinese, Cantonese. It's actually quite difficult. So stay tuned, is my answer to that. For a method question, yeah, the primary sources I'm consulting, in addition to whatever archives I was able to get in China once upon a time, I'm also trying to triangulate the materials from US, UK archives, also a lot of periodicals. There's actually a lot of periodicals in Hong Kong talking about China Resources, especially a lot of magazine articles from the 1970s, 1980s, when the public started realizing this is actually a big company. It actually dominates like a lot of aspects of our economy. What is it? And then you have all these articles saying, China Resources, the biggest, mainland company in Hong Kong, and so forth. So China Resources, as far as I know, does have an archive in Shenzhen. But I suspect that I will never be allowed to get in there. I don't know. Maybe if anyone can help me, I would be very interested to see that archive. But I think given the difficulty of archival research right now in China, and also the sensitivity is actually, a lot of this stuff is very politically sensitive still. So I can only do so much, but I think that by triangulating these different sources, newspapers, archives, legal cases, I found a lot of legal cases in Hong Kong. I'm able to paint this larger picture of China resources and its role within this shadow economy of Greater China.
Okay. I'm sure some of you might still have questions to Professor Tai, because this is such a fascinating question. But it's already like Professor Tai is currently living in Boston. It's already 11 p.m. in Boston East Coast time, so I don't want to exhaust him too much. And I'm sure we will definitely follow up on this fascinating topic and look forward to more publications of on this subject. So just let us thank Professor Tai and Professor Wang again for joining this wonderful event.
Thank you, Professor Zhang, again for this invitation, for this opportunity. Thank you, Professor Wang, for your very smart comments. Thank you again, audience members. I really appreciate the showing. 55 people, that's a lot. That's quite a bit. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.